Okay, business reasons. I mean, comics have always been this horrific patriarchy. I mean, comics came out of a need to fill the presses. It came out of that they had these printing presses that were shut down in the evening, and someone decided, well, if we could use that press time, and it started as that kind of real publishing ghetto, and it was run by demeaning men who just sort of, all that mattered was filling the pages. I don't think there was a lot there to interest women who saw the potential of the medium. Although when you trace the history of the medium, you find that a lot of women played very key roles. I wish I could remember the name. There was a woman who was the editor at Dell Comics for years and years and years. And Dell Comics was one of the real movers in the American comic industry. In fact, they were the only publisher who did not subscribe to the Comic Code Authority in 1954. They said, look, we have our own pledge to parents, leave us alone. And the newsstand distributors continued to carry Dell Comics. And it was a woman who played a key role in that.
And more women are playing key roles behind the scenes. You had a woman editor on Swamp Thing, right?
Alan, John, and I worked under Karen Berger. Karen Berger has set up one of the most interesting lines of comics at DC Comics. Because of the nature of office politics, she had to do it on her own agenda, and it was often her own, personal abilities that made these things bear fruit. Had to buck a lot of crap from in the office, and a lot of that crap still functions on the level of you're a woman. But, it's becoming more and more possible for women to work within the comics medium.
Thanks, Steve. Women editors are still the exception in comics, but in speculative fiction, they're a majority. And as for writing, while comics remain testosterone tabloids, science fiction has acknowledged, encouraged, and occasionally championed women authors. The 1967 Nebula Award winners were all men. In 1987, all but one were women, and he was a boy named Kim. I know, Lois McMaster Bujold. She has a couple of nebulas on her mantle. Hi, Lois. It's Commander Rick. Is science fiction a good platform for the treatment of women's issues?
Yes, I think so, because it can very often be a sort of thought experiment about human society. Suppose things were different, how would things come out? And you can kind of run through the cycle in the course of your story and demonstrate your ideas about how things could be different. And for any undergroup who desires change, such as women have been, it becomes a modeling for them. You allow to kind of look ahead in time and see, well, what are the other possibilities? What haven't we tried? What could we do differently than the way we're doing now? So it opens up potential paths for people to follow.
What do you think was your most feminist book, your feministest?
Ethan of Athos is, in a kind of weird reverse way, my most feminist book, since it turns all this stuff on its head, and it is, to a degree, a reaction to the kind of really awful Amazon planet stories that appeared back in the 50s. You may remember some of those.
Oh, yeah.
I will name no names.
Good, good.
But they were, in a sense, they were reflections of a society sort of shuddering on the verge of women's libs. So we had all these tales in which women were sort of fumbling around in men's roles, usually soldiering. And so Ethan sort of takes it the other way and pictures men fumbling around in women's roles, which is the other half of the women's revolution. If women change, men have to change too.
Once a normal, voluptuously beautiful woman, she drove into a nightmare of horror and saw descending from the sky a titanic monster whose fearsome touch became a frightful curse. What she saw was beyond belief until others, too, faced its hideous, uncontrollable menace. Attack of the 50-foot woman, incredibly huge, with incredible desires for love and vengeance.
Yes, the woman's perspective from 50 feet up. Try putting her on a pedestal. To get a real perspective on women's progress, let's talk to Veronica Hollinger. She co-edits Science Fiction Studies, a Montreal-based academic magazine, and she's professor of cultural studies at Trent University, where she teaches courses on dystopias, vampires, feminism, and SF. Veronica, it's Commander Rick. In science fiction's long and ongoing search for a woman's voice, who are the landmark figures?
For a while, it felt as if there was only one woman writing science fiction, and her name was Ursula Le Guin, and she had written one book, and it was The Left Hand of Darkness. This is part of the problem with what's called in the field canon construction. You know, already we have our classics, and these are the books that are talked about, the books that are read, the books that are reprinted, the books that are taught in science fiction courses, the books that are given to new readers. Joanna Russ is probably one of the most important writers for me. I find her work always delightful. It's incredibly upfront in its political commitment. It's wonderfully ironic, very, very funny in a lot of ways. And she writes with her claws out. But there are also men writing in the field who have always been conscious of these kinds of differences and the necessity of these different emphases. Samuel Delany, for instance, is the famous case in point.
What about John Varley? Would you put him in?
John Varley as well, I think, is one of the few male writers that even the most politicized feminist SF writers would agree is a feminist.
The man can write as well as a woman. Thanks, Veronica. John Varley writes strong female lead characters, and he created a future where sex change operations are as easy as going to the dentist. Say guys get to be girls and vice versa, and then versa vice back again. But there are less radical ways of avoiding gender stereotyping.
A thing that I do a lot is I leave out gender pronouns. And sometimes I edit the story afterward on purpose to take out any hints that a certain gender exists. But in general, when I'm writing the story, what I'm finding is that it doesn't matter what gender this human being is or this individual is. What matters is what happens in the story. It really amuses me to have people read certain stories and say, well, the protagonist was clearly a man. The next person says the protagonist was clearly a woman because, and they can each find evidence in the story. And if I say to them, there are no gender pronouns in the story, how did you make your decision? They say almost universally, oh. And they start to think about how they decided.
But is the solution to sexism to neuter everyone? This week, Dr. Gilding battles Captain Capon for the love of hermaphrodite. We need to acknowledge the differences, but creating a realistic female character involves more than naming her Georgette.
Now what I'm afraid is happening is that you have a lot of strong female characters that are almost like male characters disguised as female characters, but some people who say, well, they're not quite sure how to deal with female characters, but they know they can't keep them in traditional roles quite as much without a good reason for it, at least, without explaining why the society is like that. And so what they'll do is they'll just simply have a male character, a female character who's actually a male character disguised as a woman. Almost a transvestite kind of character, I suppose.
Speaking of which, check out Pam's story, Fears. It's about a woman who dresses up like a man, but not for fun. Medical technology made it possible to choose your child's sex, and everyone chose boys. Now it's dangerous to be one of the few remaining women.
The tension between the sexes is, I think, so fundamental to the human species. Some people say what we want to do is relax that tension and get rid of that tension. I think it's one of our secret weapons. I think it's one of our adaptations that has made the species such a big success over the last couple of million years. And exploring that is an endless game. It's a great game, and it should be played by everyone. But it ain't easy. It certainly ain't easy if you're also trying to do all the other science fictional things, such as create a whole world, introduce a new idea, motivate a plot, show a background, and keep your style intact. The problem with writing good science fiction is that you have to keep all the balls in the air. You can't really often just write a characterological novel as you can in the mainstream, or a plot-dominated novel as you can in the mainstream. You have to typically do everything, and of course it's not any surprise that you necessarily don't do each one of those quite so well.
Cop-out. I used up so many pages explaining how men had developed a four-dimensional time disruptor that I only had time to make all the women cheerleaders. Look, if aliens can take over Washington, why can't women? Science fiction's freedom to imagine is even attracting mainstream writers. Leona Gom's first science fiction novel is The Y Chromosome. Environmental damage virtually wipes out men. Leona, it's Commander Rick. Was it difficult for you creating your character Daniel, knowing that, well, on one level he was an individual, on another level he would represent all men?